Inciting incidents. The hook. The fact that a lot of writers don't understand where to place their hook or mistake it for the inciting incident doesn't mean you have to emulate their mistakes. Not if you want to do better, and especially if you hope to make better sales. This is because most advice focuses on that one all-important incident. This can be one of the most misleading pieces of advice because while there is one larger inciting incident that launches your core story, it won't be nearly as effective if you don't understand there are two others in the first quarter, and all three build upon one another. Today we're going to be talking about the first of the three most important inciting incidents, the hook. This is also my contribution to ProjectAuthortube, put together by Tamara Woods, to help make sure your Preptober plans for NaNoWriMo get the best results possible. I'm Robert Jones, and you're watching The Story Detective, where we solve the mysteries of storycraft and place the power of words at your fingertips. If you've done even a small tour of online advice videos or read only the most recent and popular of craft books, it's altogether likely you've heard some misconceptions about inciting incidents, where they should be placed and why. You've likely distilled this advice down to your favorite craft book, an online guru, or maybe you've just gotten sick of hearing advice because all of them send mixed messages. This is usually because pieces of the bigger picture are missing. When you hear someone say, plant your inciting incident as soon as possible, or my inciting incident happens on page 8 or 20, run in the other direction, because while I'm sure they do have an inciting incident on those pages, what they're referring to is a hook, and not a very well-placed hook. By definition, the hook is the first of three inciting incidents in the first quarter of any story. Inciting incidents can be subtle, crafty, possibly as invisible as a single tree in a forest until you stumble over their roots, and suddenly you're falling. Where you land, what's in front of you, what you're propelling towards becomes extremely important after that, because you're no longer in control. This is the position in which an effective hook places the reader. In its simplest terms, the hook ignites the curiosity factor and should launch an arrow towards the emotional heart of your core story, which is essentially the story problem every hero has to overcome. And we can't root for the hero until we empathize with them. The sooner readers become empathizing, the sooner they become invested. Put another way, my first writing mentor described this as starting the engine of your story. It's the moment where your ideal reader can't stop reading because they've been hooked. Placement of the hook is one of the most common mistakes I see in most manuscripts. In most of your favorite books, you'll find the hook is planted within the first 3 pages. And there's a reason for this. It has long been considered that the first 3 pages was the maximum any agent or publisher would read before rejecting your manuscript or passing it on to an assistant to read. But did you know this is considered to be exactly the number of pages readers will skim before buying a novel? But some of you are shaking your head thinking, it takes longer to build up these things. You might be surprised. Some avid readers who aren't writers will read further, I'm sure. But you're not just an ordinary reader, are you? You're a writer, damn it. And I assure you these rules came about for logical reasons. Once upon a time, the world of book publishing was considered a cottage industry. During this time before corporations took over, editors spent more time with writers, and publishers sent representatives to bookstores, and they asked questions, took surveys. All the statistics that can be boiled down by numbers through technology didn't exist yet. So a phone call, or sometimes footwork needed to be done. Sometimes the bigger publishing houses of the day ran experiments and observed the buying habits of real people. They were a business after all, and they still needed to sell books to make a profit. The experiment, which resulted in the optimal placement for the hook, consisted of sending employees to what was then considered the largest book chains. The experiment which resulted in the optimal placement for the hook consisted of sending employees to what was then considered the larger book chains. And pretending to be customers, they would follow real customers into various sections of the store and observe them like voyeurs, peeping over the books they weren't actually reading. The end result of this experiment was that nobody read past page 3 before putting the book down and moving to the next, or taking it to the register for purchase. And now that you understand the rationale and study behind it, you can see how this advice has grown into variations on the theme throughout time, and people essentially playing post office or hammering down on the notion because all the statistics about attention spans becoming shorter. The fact is, attention spans for non-readers have always been short. But as life in modern times have given people more to do to waste their time, social media for example, few people engage with stories that don't capture their attention quickly. Let's look at some hooks most of the world is familiar with. Star Wars: A New Hope. That's the first film for those who may be uninitiated. It's also one of the most widely taught screenplays because it's so spot on structurally. The story began with a series of scenes, all of which were designed to incite the audience. However, there's only one that can be the hook. We first see a giant galactic destroyer chasing a smaller ship across the expanse of space, both figuratively and literally taking up the entire screen because the destroyer is huge. Secondly, stormtroopers board the ship and engage in a firefight with the crew. We see the villain Darth Vader for the first time. Hear his ominous breathing as he boards the smaller vessel. We're also introduced to Princess Leia as we see her inserting plans for the Death Star into R2-D2, one of the two droids who makes their way to an escape pod just before Leia is captured. That's all crammed into the first few minutes of the movie, none of which is the hook. As the escape pod launches through space, the sensors from the destroyer pick it up, but it doesn't register any life forms. They assume it was launched by mistake during the firefight. In the final shot of that sequence, we see the pod hurtling towards the planet Tatooine below, home of Luke Skywalker, whose uncle will acquire the two droids, placing Luke and his family in the crosshairs of the Empire, and Vader, who's looking for the two droids. That's launching the Arrow, or escape pod in this case. We haven't even met Luke yet, who has no idea what awaits him. This is a perfect hook, and we can learn a lot from it. The hook always threatens to upend the status quo. It can involve the hero directly or indirectly. It foreshadows what's to come with a sense of intrigue. The villain is usually at the other end of the bow, which launches the arrow. This is the point where we see the hero is either in bad trouble or is about to walk into it. It's also worth noting here that many of the best hooks are built toward the end of that first short sequence, which is why you'll find so many of them at the end of page 3 in so many novels. The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. The hook here is not built in a short scene or sequence. That doesn't make it any less effective. In fact, if you're looking to publish traditionally, having the hook on page 1 can be beneficial. Because while I previously said you have 3 pages to hook an agent, which is true, that's usually the maximum they'll read before deciding your novel is worth their time. However, that doesn't mean all agents will diligently read 3 pages. Some will only read page 1, or sometimes only the first half of page 1, in which case The Hunger Games gives us a perfect example. Suzanne Collins places the hook at the end of her opening paragraph, and it's a short paragraph at that. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed into bed with Mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. 4 short sentences, and the arrow is launched in a single word, reaping. It doesn't sound like fun. It actually sounds ominous as hell. And we understand through Sister Prim, it's the stuff of nightmares. As readers, we have no idea what the reaping consists of yet, but our imaginations are churning because the engine of the story is ignited. We empathize because trouble is threatening to upend the social strata, even in the dismal existence within District 12. It's linked directly to the core, the machinations of the villain, and foreshadows trouble for the hero, Katniss, whose name we don't even know for several pages yet. Instead, we get the story of a cat. Not a coincidental choice by the author, who came to their home malnourished, becomes a hunter, and will learn to eat entrails without hissing. That's just not the closest thing to love she'll experience. It's their lives. It's Katniss's story. In a nutshell. Pretty clever use of symbology, huh? and through a personal detail about the relationship between the hero and this cat. A side note about backstory up front. It has to characterize in an important way or it needs to be left for later. I see too many first novels self-published that begin by tossing the reader a bone to intrigue them, and then they leap immediately into backstory, sometimes even attempting to foreshadow relationships with characters we haven't even met yet. Things that are best shown in their own good time. Having an effective hook up front doesn't mean you get a free pass to cram as much history as you can into those first pages. Info dumping is considered bad form even when popular writers do it. You'll notice by page 3 of The Hunger Games, Katniss is heading into the woods to hunt with her bow, a danger not only because of the predators and landmines, but it's also a crime punishable by public execution if she's caught. So the intrigue continues to build and her actions continue to characterize by showing readers that she takes risks and she's capable. All of which is pretty important things to know as the plot progresses, otherwise they might be best left for later. I'm convinced that most info dumping isn't intentional. Newer writers are simply afraid readers need those extraneous details or they won't understand. If there's too many details in those opening pages, readers won't remember them anyway. Notice how selective the details are in these examples. No one is sitting around a dinner table or a classroom or having conversations about math tests or thinking about food. We also aren't getting a lot of time spent on clothing. The scenes are chosen to symbolically show some of the important details about the hero's character and the trouble heading their way. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. This is a novel that has some pretty enormous problems, some of which can and have been excused as being fine because it's YA. I've heard that one quite a lot. Other things in the book can't be excused for any reason. But if there's one thing this book does well, it's creating empathy for Harry. Everyone wants to see him get away from the Dursleys and get into Hogwarts so badly because of that initial empathy. The hook, however, is also done a bit differently. That's because it's derived from several things within those first few pages, working in conjunction and pushing readers forward to a payoff at the end of the first chapter. It's also good to keep in mind that while there's no one true form for fiction, it does not mean just because it's different that the craft principles aren't there, because good craft techniques are meant to be malleable. The first 3 pages of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone has everything to do with Harry, and though he doesn't make an appearance in those pages, the arrow is certainly launched by the villain. But we don't see how or why up front. We also don't see Harry heading for trouble right away either. All of these things do come together by the end of the first chapter. So how exactly did J.K. Rowling set this story in motion? There are 3 separate things at work which form the hook in this story. If they all weren't working towards a single goal, the end would never justify the means. The title of the chapter has significant resonance, The Boy Who Lived. Intrigues readers because it sounds as if the boy survived a tragedy of some magnitude. That portent comes before we've even read the first sentence. It's a great example of how chapter titles can be put to good use. On its own, however, it doesn't fire an arrow at the core story because we aren't actually certain it refers to Harry at that point, are we? But we are curious to understand what it means. The Dursleys are the first characters to which we are introduced. We understand they don't care for things strange and mysterious. They also have a secret they wouldn't want their neighbors to know about. Mrs. Dursley is related to the Potters. And we get intimations that the Potters fit into this category of the strange and mysterious and are to be avoided at all costs. The strange and mysterious quickly begins. Mr. Dursley sees a cat reading a map. People filling the streets in colorful cloaks. An abundance of owls. All of these strange happenings seem to be pressing in on the carefully planned reality created by the Dursleys to avoid such things. And we begin to get the idea that it has to do with the Potters, particularly Harry, because the writing on the wall is becoming fairly evident by this time. I think it's worth noting this multi-part hook, as it were, wouldn't be nearly as effective if we didn't see how it all came together around Harry and Voldemort relatively soon. by the end of the chapter, 17 pages later to be precise. Would it have worked as well without all the imaginative particularities? Absolutely not. Each of these particularities fall quickly upon one another, laying stones that form a path readers keep following for answers. When I talk about particularities, it's a term used by my first writing mentor to describe actions that were fresh, eccentric, or otherwise made a character stand out. For the writer, this is also choosing writerly words crafted in a way that makes those actions and characteristics come alive. Readers pay for an experience that's more interesting and imaginative than much of what they see in their day-to-day life. So why do I see so many novels self-published that start with characters behaving in mundane or very ordinary circumstances? Luke Skywalker may have seemed like an ordinary farm boy, but he also had a dream to become a pilot and fly among the stars, a dream his uncle stood in the way of his achieving. Because even the most ordinary of characters needs a problem and an obstacle before we can empathize. Katniss Everdeen lives in a boring district filled with complacent, boring people, yet she's not willing to lay down and accept the rules created by the powers that be, even though breaking them could mean her life, possibly even the lives of her family if she's caught hopping the fence and hunting with an illegal weapon. We also empathize with characters who have habits that aren't nice or could become detrimental. Harry Potter isn't even old enough to be aware of what his life will become when his arrow is launched. So it's fitting that the writer take a little time to show those mysterious happenings going on because of him, because he's not old enough to hold the narrative when the story begins. So it's given to his uncle, who is looking at everything he encounters through a contemptuous gaze. It's also a reverse empathy for Harry because we understand his uncle is a very cantankerous obstacle. Everything is calculated for effect. That's the entire plan behind those first 3 pages, or the hook falls short. A strong hook chains the reader to the vehicle of the plot and drags them along for a bumpy ride, vicariously. Here's a checklist of ingredients for devising your own best hook. Needs to happen by the end of page 3. Launches an arrow, which is meant to thrust your hero towards the core conflict. Creates a sense of empathy because readers who hate trouble in life begin rooting for the hero who they want to see overcome opposition. Can involve the hero directly or indirectly. Shows the hero in trouble or foreshadows what's coming, thus igniting intrigue by introducing stakes. It's always an offshoot of the villain's machinations, who is ultimately the cause of sending that arrow into flight. They are the opposition and represent all the hero must overcome. If you can check off that list for your hook, congrats. You are ahead of 98% of the class. If you can't, there still may be some work to do. But I assure you it's work worth doing. Look over the first few pages of your favorite books. See how a variety of writers handle their hooks. And if this video helped your Preptober plans get off on the right foot, don't forget to like and subscribe. I also have a Ko-fi account linked in the description if you'd like to help support my channel. Remember, launching an effective story takes 3 key inciting incidents, and we'll be discussing the other 2 in this Preptober series. So until next time, keep those keyboards clacking.